So what is today's book review?
Today's book review will be on The Apology of Socrates by Plato.
Alrighty. The Socrates of Plato involves how many dialogues?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how many dialogues is in the book, but this is the first dialogue. I don't know if it was, and I don't know if any scholar knows whether or not it was the first dialogue that Plato wrote, but at the starting point is the Trial of Socrates.
Could you get more into depth on the dialogue and the trial of Socrates?
Yes. Essentially, Socrates was brought to court for corrupting the youths and believing in gods of his own invention rather than the gods sanctioned by the state. And he's brought to court by three prosecutors, being Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, and they are calling for the death penalty.
So can you define the three individuals that you had just named and what their roles are?
Yes, well, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon all are representing different groups of the Athenians who want Socrates to die for what they allege he is doing. And one of them represents, I can't quite remember the order. I know Lycon represented the orators who were out to get Socrates. Miletus, I think, was the poets, and Anytus was, I might have these two backwards, but Anytus, I think, was the one who was representing the politicians and the professional men.
Okay. Explain why they felt like that he should be trialed on a belief that he has through his own studies.
Well, for one thing, the question implies that he really did have gods of his own invention rather than the gods sanctioned by the state. And what we find as we read through the dialogue of Socrates' defense is that the charges were misrepresentations of him and what he did. And it really was spurred by a great deal of resentment towards him, because what he did was he went around Athens talking to people, questioning them, people who were very full of themselves, essentially, and he cut them down a peg or two because he showed that they were not really wise and wherein they professed to be wise. And beginning with, and we also have to keep in mind that the Athenians they had this slander about him, and it started because of this, because very powerful men in Athens were basically humiliated before Socrates and before other people because they were shown to be fools, essentially. And there was a great deal of slander about him for many, many years, and many of the jurymen were children or adolescents, as Socrates pointed out, when they began hearing these stories about him, and there was no one to defend Socrates at the time because they didn't speak with Socrates himself or any of his followers. But there was, we can see it in the play of Aristophanes called The Clouds, where Socrates is portrayed as somebody who makes the weaker argument the stronger and goes around saying things about the heavens and the earth that is complete nonsense. But I hope I answered your question there. I know I kind of rambled a little bit on different things that were tangentially related to it, but I hope that answered your question.
So, back to where you first started talking, it brought a question to mind. Why would, I guess I'm assuming, why would this incident occur to where Socrates has to defend himself based off of wrongful judgment?
Okay, well, clearly it was not within the Athenian constitution that they had no right to free speech. And it was really, I guess you could say, the heritage of Socrates and Plato as to why. I mean, we take free speech for granted in our society. Fortunately, the founding fathers were very enlightened people, and they ensured that that was the first right that we would have. I mean, we consider it a natural right, which justly so, and we consider it a constitutional right, which it is, clearly. But they did not have that then, obviously, because we reached a point in history in the ancient Greece and ancient Athens where someone could be brought to trial for essentially using truth to show that these people were fools. I mean, they professed wisdom due to either the fact that they were an expert in one field or not, and they thought they knew everything about everything. And Socrates showed that it was actually stemmed from, it's the arrogance of a knowledge or not really knowledge, because knowledge isn't what they had, but it's the arrogance of ignorance where someone who knows little claims to know much. And Socrates actually, and this is sort of a tangent, but I want to make this clear as far as the actual allegations against Socrates that they were untrue. He actually began what he saw as a religious duty to expose ignorance and to help to enlighten people by making them realize how little they know and seeking to actually gain knowledge through a dialectical process to arrive at truth. And he actually began this as a religious duty because one of his friends, I think it was Cryto, went to the oracle at Delphi, which was a priestess that spoke through the divine inspiration of Apollo. And the tradition was that the oracle never lied and everything the oracle said was true. And it's pretty interesting. I mean, I don't want to get too far away from topic, but much of what we know about what the oracle said in the past came to fruition, whether with the Peloponnesian War or whatever else. Take that as you will. But Cryto asked a question of the oracle, and that was, is there any man alive who is wiser than Socrates? The oracle said, no. And Socrates was puzzled about this because he was very conscious of his ignorance on many things. So that's why he began asking questions of people who were reputed to be wise, and he found that he was wiser than them in this sense, that he was conscious of his ignorance where he was ignorant, and they were not. They assumed to be wise, they assumed to know things that they didn't know, and Socrates was very well aware of what he did not know. And he asked himself the question after he made this trial of the politicians, the poets, and all these other people, the professional craftsmen and everyone else that was assumed to be wise because they had some sort of expertise or some sort of social standing. And he asked himself if he would rather be wise with his wisdom, knowing what he did not know, or have knowledge in the things that they knew, yet stupid with their, basically he put it, wise in their wisdom, yet stupid with their stupidity, and their stupidity being their arrogance, their arrogating knowledge to themselves that they did not really have. And he replied through himself to the oracle, I would rather be as I am.
So my next question is what was Socrates' religion, and how did it play a role in either his persecution or his dismissal of his alleged accusations of charges, and what is the oracle and why that played such a huge role?
Okay, so Socrates' religion, I'm not entirely comfortable answering this question to the full extent because, like I said, it's the first dialogue. There's many more to come. But from what I can glean from Socrates' religion is that he believed in the oracle at Delphi, which is to say that he followed the ancient Greek religion, and he basically he believed in Apollo. And what his idea, I would say, from from reading the dialogue, a few aspects of his religious belief are clear. And the first one is that God is morally upright and good and pure, and that our duty as human beings is to be as good as possible, not as not to gain, for instance, great reputation or wealth or honor or what you will, but rather, more important than all of that is to be a good person. And he exemplified that in the way that he lived. As he says himself, his religious duty, basically, his service to God reduced him to poverty, because he did not charge for, like the sophists did. He did not charge people money to hear him speak, because he did not feel that he had the kind of knowledge that these sophists claim to have. And he did not feel that that knowledge should be something that should be bought and sold. It's more important than that. It's more essential than that. It's more significant than that. I mean, it's something that we should all want people to have, not for a fee, but rather to better and improve their characters. So yes, Socrates' religion, he followed Apollo, clearly. He followed a god that he believed was, or his conception of God is one that is morally upright, morally good, pure, and it requires us to be honest, and requires us to live, to be the best people we can. And another aspect of his religion is that, his we'll get to this more when we get to the Phaedo, which is his beliefs about the immortality of the soul and some of the afterlife and all of that. But I don't want to go too far into it now. I have read the Phaedo before, only once though, so I can't really speak at length about it. But in a nutshell, he did believe that basically we will be punished or rewarded accordingly to the way that we live on earth. And that he, even in the Apology, he expresses some ideas about transmigration of the soul to a domain, whether it be something like a heaven or something like a hell or something, or whether it be, this life again, what you will. He does mention the transmigration of the soul to a different plane once the body is dead. And he does, he even mentions the idea of whether or not, well, I don't, like I said, I'll go ahead and stop that here. I think that hopefully that answers your question, but I'll get more into this stuff when we actually get to the Phaedo, which is the third dialogue in the book.
As far as his religion goes, how did that play with him in court, or is the session of that continue into another dialogue?
Well, as far as the religious thing, like I said earlier on, previously, that one of the allegations against him was that he did not believe in the gods of the state, and that he created gods of his own invention. And then when he actually goes into dismantling this allegation, which I think he did very well with all of these things, because the allegations were trumped up charges. They were not accurate in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But he goes into his accuser, his prosecutor that he's speaking with, cross-questioning, says that he believes in gods of his own invention, and then Socrates presses him further, and he makes the claim that no, he doesn't believe in any of the gods. He's a complete atheist, which Socrates also dismantles. I mean, a clear example of this is when he said that in his deposition, which we don't have, but Socrates goes into the deposition against him. He says that Socrates believes in supernatural activities, but then he goes on in the trial to say that, he disbelieves in gods altogether, and Socrates makes a good point. And he argues a lot by analogy, and he brings the truth to light a lot by analogy. And he said, do people believe in horse-like activities, but not in horses? Or is there anyone who believes in musical activities, but not in musicians? Well, and the guy did not want to answer him because he obviously saw where he was going with this. And then he says, does anyone believe in supernatural activities, but not in supernatural beings? And then the guy finally concedes, no, they don't. And this he does by the compulsion of the court, which is made clear in the dialogue. But Socrates then goes on to mention, such things as, these beings that you say I believe in, then, whether they be demigods or children of the gods or whatever, it would not make sense that I would believe in them and not in the gods, because, for instance, who would believe in the... and he goes to nature again for analogy, and he says, who would believe in the young of donkeys, but not in donkeys themselves? So who would believe in this offspring of something, but not the thing itself, which produces the offspring?
Okay, so the oracle, could you explain what the oracle is and why that was such a major factor?
Okay, so it's a major factor because, as I said, Socrates followed Apollo, Phoebus Apollo, who was a Greek god, and the oracle was the oracle of Apollo, and the oracle at Delphi essentially, like, for instance, we have different in Herodotus and Thucydides. It's been a long time since I've read Thucydides. I've never read Herodotus, but I know some of the stories. Like, if you remember the movie 300, it's taken from something that happened during the Persian Wars, which we know about because of Herodotus wrote it all down. But the oracle at Delphi was what the ancient Greeks, no matter whether they're an Athenian, a Spartan, from any of the city-states of ancient Greece, they would go to for wisdom, because it had a reputation, or the priestess, the oracle of Delphi, a priestess, had the reputation for always speaking from the inspiration of Apollo, who never lied. So they would have, and a lot of times it would be, sometimes it would be clear, and other times it would be almost like a riddle, but it would be very clear after the event happened that the oracle was telling the truth, such as, I'm sorry that I can't quite remember the example, but it was either from, I think, the Peloponnesian War or the Persian War, that the oracle basically predicted the outcome, and I mean, it told what was going to happen. I think it might have been something along. I don't want to speak out of ignorance and out of misremembering what it was. So actually, I'll go ahead and save that for later if we ever get back to it, or once I do read. Like I said, on this year it's all going to be philosophical works, but maybe next year I'll get a lot more into history and I can tell you a little bit more about that. But maybe I'll look it up, or if any of you viewers would prefer to look it up yourself as far as the oracle and learn a little bit more about it, then that would be fine too.
So, as far as the first dialogue, was the...
Is that...
Yeah, it's facing you.
Okay.
As far as the first dialogue goes, and him being, in a sense, the court trying to crucify him for this, does this session continue on through dialogues, or did it end at the first dialogue?
Okay, so the first dialogue, in a nutshell, is, of course, his trial, his defense at his trial, basically. And it ends after Socrates the votes have been cast, and I'm not exactly sure how many people were in the jury, but the ancient Greek or ancient Athenian jury had a lot of people, because he says that it was a small difference. A 30 vote difference was actually a small difference in the ancient Athenian jury. And it was by 30 votes that it was decided that Socrates was to be put to death. So it ends with him speaking on the verdict, and speaking specifically to his friends and all the jurymen who voted for his release. And for it also, he speaks to the people who voted that he be put to death. And he was voted, obviously, like I said, to be put to death. And it ends there with him addressing everyone, the one group and then the next. And the story does continue into the following two dialogues, however, because I'm not going to get into it now because this is about the apology. But the Cryto and the Phaedo end the whole story of the trial and death of Socrates. Because in the Cryto, basically, and we'll get into this later, but I will give you a quick overview of them. In the Cryto, his friend Cryto comes to him and basically tries to convince him to escape. And he has the opportunity to do so because he has very good friends, and they've figured out a way to convey him to a different city-state or a different location, and avoid him being put to death. But the Cryto, he basically convinces Cryto, and he explains why he feels that it would not be, or he thinks that it would not be just for him to escape the verdict and to escape execution. And we'll get into that later, but it has to do with his desire. It was sort of a social contract idea that he has between him and the laws of Athens, even though he was wrongly convicted and wrongly put to death. It's sort of what I see as a social contract idea that, hey, look, I'm 70 years old. I agreed to live under the Athenian constitution, and it would be unlawful for me to go against, or to be a lawbreaker in the sense of going against the verdict that was conducted or effectuated. Now, the Phaedo is the final dialogue of this story, the trial and death of Socrates, and in that we will get into it later, obviously, in detail. But that is a dialogue that's predominantly about the immortality of the soul, or Socrates' argument for the immortality of the soul, and then him drinking the hemlock in which he is executed. He dies by drinking hemlock. That was the for executions in ancient Athens, that was what was agreed upon.
So to kind of finish the book review off for the first dialogue, in your own words, an opinionated statement, how do you feel as far as him being executed and why you think he should or should not have been executed, and the principles of why you think the Constitution or law of Athens should have been changed, in your opinion, or not changed?
Okay, so to address all of those, maybe in that order or maybe not, but to address the whole question, or the multiple questions that you have within that question, or each aspect of it. I feel, it's very clear to me that he should not have been condemned to death. It's very clear to me that it was a unjust decision on the part of the Athenian jury, and it's very clear to me that the truth and justice was not served by him being condemned to death. Instead, the resentment of powerful people was served. So the power of truth is that we can read this dialogue over 2,000 years later and see that an injustice was done, and ultimately Socrates did prevail, because part of what he did was speak in his trial about, he spoke as, he says that he's going to speak sort of in a prophetic manner, and that is the sense that his death is not going to silence Socrates. Socrates is going to continue to speak, both in his own words, as we have through Plato, as well as the power of truth that was enlightened the minds of many Athenians who discoursed with Socrates and proceeded to no longer be held back by Socrates once he was executed, and it just made the situation for those people who valued wrongdoing. It made the situation a lot worse for them because it just unleashed, Pandora's box essentially. So yeah, he was wrongfully condemned. That's very clear, and I think that. What was the other part of your? I answered some aspects of it, but what have I not answered?
I
in your
definitely think, as an add a couple more add-on questions, is explain more so in depth why he was wrongfully condemned or injusted by the
Right.
courts, because you gave a brief description, but maybe a more in depth would help get an understanding better as compared to something vague and brief.
Well, I think I sort of answered that earlier in our conversation, and that was basically the allegations against him were wrong. I mean, it was slander. It wasn't the actual truth of the matter, such as him disbelieving in the gods or believing in gods of his own invention, and also him corrupting the youths, which I guess I did not entirely answer that or have that part of the allegation. I did not quite convey how he dismantled that, but I will now. Um, Basically, Socrates, in truth, sought for people to value truth, value goodness, and to become better human beings. And instead, he was convicted of corrupting the youth because basically what happened, the reason why they said this, these powerful people and these other resenters of Socrates, is that their wrong acts, their wrong thinking, and their wrong ideas about various matters and their false wisdom was exposed not just by Socrates, but by many of the people who attached themselves to Socrates, because he mentions that there was a lot of youths with wealthy fathers and et cetera, that had a lot of leisure time, so they stuck with Socrates because they enjoyed seeing how he cross-questioned people and exposed their ignorance, and then they went on to do the same thing. So that's why he had this allegation against him of corrupting the youths. It was clear that he wasn't corrupting them. It was clear that he was enlightening them, and they were going on to expose the injustices and the wrongdoing and the wrong thinking in the Athenian society. Another thing that I wanted to mention about the dialogue before this ends is that Socrates mentions, and this just goes to show the kind of virtue that he had. He would have been he mentions that people in Athenian the political system of Athens, people that engaged in going into offices or going into politics, a good man in the Athenian political system, or in a position in the political system of Athens, would be put to death or would die, and that's why he avoided politics, because he wanted to be able to help in the private sector, so it would influence all that stuff. But he knew that if he actually was to have engaged in being attached to a position in the political system, he would have been put to death. And he mentions two instances where he was placed in a position where he was involved in the politics of Athens. One was when he was devoted to the council, and he was the only member of the council who sided with the constitution of Athens to not try the generals who showed up to a naval battle late en bloc, try them all together as one, rather than trying them individually. That he voted against trying them all together because it was against the Constitution, and he was the only man who stood up for the Constitution. And he was in danger of being put to death. And the other instance was when the 30 tyrants had control of Athens after the Peloponnesian War, when the democracy was replaced with an oligarchy. And basically, he said, the 30 tyrants wanted to make as many people complicit with their crimes as they were. So they summoned 5 people, one of them Socrates, to go arrest an individual to be put to death unjustly. Socrates was the only one of them who did not do it. He had the conscience to not act unjustly, even though he would then be in danger of being put to death, which he said he very well would have had it not been for the workings of fate, in which the oligarchy was soon afterwards overthrown, so he wasn't put to death then. So it just shows, I think the dialogue, really reading it carefully, shows that there was a lot of corruption in ancient Athens, and Socrates was one of the, basically, what we would call sort of, a whistleblower or a luminary now who exposed that corruption and sought to change Athens, or change the world, or change, whatever you want to say, change the lot of that society for the better, to be a light in the world of darkness, essentially.
So, my last 2 questions, we'll start with the first one. As far as the dialogue and the history times, comparing it to now, in the present at which we live in, do you think that anything of these teachings or this knowledge of power essentially affects or doesn't affect the world that we live in currently? And do you believe that some of these things still occur, and certain things that don't occur based off of the world that we live in, and what can be done to change it?
Well, that's a very good question, and is very, it requires a lot of pondering to really get at a very good insight regarding it, because I think it's very clear that injustices still occur. People in position of power, there's still corruption, not necessarily intrinsic to, but there's a lot of whether you're speaking globally, whether you're speaking nationally, there's still going to be. It's human nature, I think, that it's, there's. I'm not going to say there's always, because I'm not a prophet, and I'm not so arrogant as to claim that I know what the future is going to look like. But hitherto, it's not a bad prediction to say there's always going to be corruption in places of power. That maybe not as has always been the case, but very often, very frequently, we find that there is corruption in powerful places. That is not to say by any means that everyone in power are corrupt, or that just because somebody has a position of power, they're going to be corrupt. I don't think that's the case either. I think there has been many instances of very, powerful people who are also had a great deal of integrity, a good insight into what the right thing to do is, that were just in their actions. But that's not always the case. We see both good people and bad people in positions of power. And